Great. So today I have Stefan Eiskens on the podcast. Stefan is a freelance senior cloud and cloud native architect. He is living in the Brussels area and he is the author of the book, The Azure Cloud Native Architecture Map Book, which I read some time ago. Really enjoyed it. We're going to talk more about why he wrote the book and also more the special things about the book later on in the session. We have lots of things to cover, so thank you, Stefan, for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. So very happy and excited to be part of this show, right?
Perfect. So, for those of us actually who don't know you yet, can you take a minute and describe your background and how you ended up writing this book?
Yeah, well, actually, I started my career a long time ago, right, in 1999. Oh, in 1999. So you see, it's quite a while ago. And I basically started as a developer. Let's say, developed during more than a decade. Then I became more, application architect, and then I was also started to be interested by infrastructure as well. And in the end, actually, and I let's say since 20 or 2005, I really specialize more on the Microsoft technologies. And so basically, I always tried to follow a bit what Microsoft was doing. And so the rise of Azure, let's say about 13 years ago, maybe even more, 15 years ago. Basically, so it came, and so I said, okay, I need to also go to Azure, and also there was a personal interest anyway. It's a very broad playground. And so then, of course, moving forward, I could see that in the public clouds you also have an emphasis on security. So I started to also be interested by security topics. So basically, I more or less cover. I have a background that is I can talk to developers, can talk to infrastructure people, and also to security people. So that's a bit how actually that's why I wrote that book in the end, because I'm typically in my day-to-day job, I mostly sell myself as an SME, right, subject matter expert, and I talk to actually security architects, to application architects, and to infrastructure architects about good practices that we have to do in the cloud and so on. And so when I said, okay, this book maybe, Microsoft Doc is great, but it's often you go quite quickly in the walkthrough. So I really wanted to step back a bit, see, zoom out, see the broader picture, try to see, okay, what are the options that you have, and then you can zoom in, right? And of course, you have to dig also on your own on some topics because you cannot go into every detail. Uh, Also, I don't have the skills about every detail, right? And that's how this book was born, basically, to try to help you navigate, let's say, the broad landscape of Azure and
Yes.
Kubernetes. Yeah,
Yeah, it's actually wonderful because I remember, I think this book is, from
yeah,
2021,
it's
something like
already, yeah,
that. But I read it, I think, a year and a half ago. And when I read it, it was for the first time I actually was like, I could see the big picture of Azure. It's like in a helicopter view, you
yeah,
get the 10,000 feet view. And for the first time, I saw all the domains
yeah,
and how they connect.
yeah, yeah.
So
That was
that's,
really the intention. So that's happy that,
yeah,
yeah,
wonderful, actually. So when we talk about cloud, we talk about cloud adoption and seeing organizations moving towards public
yeah.
cloud in that sense. How are you seeing that evolution of cloud adoption today? And what are the main drivers for organizations to move to cloud in your
Yeah.
experience?
Well, so in my experience, I would say that, well, I've always, let's say, worked for companies that have more hybrid environment, right? So still a lot of on-premises, let's say, systems, and then embracing the cloud typically for time to market. That's one of the typical drivers to actually go faster. They sometimes have pain points on premises that it's not going fast enough to build new applications, to release new applications. So the cloud somehow with many off-the-shelf services, like especially in the PaaS and fast or serverless space, well, comes with a lot of services that you can assemble and start using. So that's one of the drivers that I see. Sometimes it could be, or it could sound a bit strange, but actually I've seen some organizations going to the cloud for a better security. So, for instance, organizations that had troubles on-prem, so of course I will not name them, but really security issues on-prem, really hacked. And so they, instead of revamping completely on the on-prem environment, well, actually trying to do stuff in parallel, starting new data centers in the cloud, the right way, right? So and so that can seem a bit weird because initially, especially the public cloud, typically this sometimes this just in the name, right? It can disturb some security architects. But that's something I've really seen a few times already. And then, of course, and cost, but cost can be, it's more subject to debate because, you have running costs, you have total cost of ownership, and it's actually quite hard to compare costs because it's a bit like comparing Apple and peers, right? You don't always know what you exactly compare. So it's cost and also cost can be, that's also why you see now the rise of FinOps. It can also hit you back in the cloud as well if you don't pay attention. So, but that's also one of the drivers, right? But then companies can really make, let's say, spare money, but still it requires attention because otherwise you could spend more than really expected. That's a bit in a nutshell. So what I see as well is that initially, at least on the Azure side, and because of course cloud is broader than Azure, I could initially see, let's say, companies embracing the PaaS, right, landscape, more the public flavor of the PaaS landscape. But now that Azure is actually bringing more and more features to lock down the PaaS services to privatize them, well, I actually kind of see this, right, that everybody, even smaller companies, try to lock it down completely. So that's a change that I could observe almost everywhere, large and small companies. Yeah.
That's very interesting, and we'll talk more about that
Yeah.
definitely. I also like the fact that you say that security is one of the drivers
Yeah.
for companies to go to cloud.
Yeah.
I always say that to shock organizations, like if you configure cloud well, it is more secure than on premise.
Mhm.
But if you misconfigure it, your data is on the streets.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a that's a good analogy. That's right. Yeah, indeed.
Go
No,
ahead.
no,
Go ahead.
and indeed. So that's really key. So the cloud is all based on the shared responsibility model. So basically, indeed, because for single service you can use that. Let's say 10 different ways. You might have, just to take for instance a concrete example, if you take the storage account right in Azure, like S3 and AWS. Well, it could. You can still do that. It has a bit changed, but you can use that as a service to store static pages, for instance, for a public website, right? And where, for instance, those pages would just really be publicly available because that's the use case. So meaning that the same storage account, you could host that to, store your own PDF files. I mean, something data sensitive. And so if you configure it the way that you had configured it for, for the static website, then indeed you have a data leak. And so, but Microsoft comes with, a broad offering. And so it's up to you to make sure that you indeed use the service correctly for your needs. And then, of course, you have to do your homework to secure it. But as you said, one misconfiguration and it could be, yeah, you could have a data leak before you know it. Yeah.
Exactly. So, in your experience, are organizations more using IaaS or PaaS today? And do you see a significant move towards
Yeah.
PaaS?
Well, actually, for me, that's my own experience. It's mostly PaaS, but I also know it depends a bit on the um, yeah, of course, on the initial drivers as well. So if the drivers are more to time to market and so on, typically you go more for PaaS, right? Because, but again, it's off-the-shelf services you can assemble to build solutions. While IaaS is mostly about, yeah, you would be you are looking more for a disaster recovery, for instance, solution where you want to extend your on-premises data center, and then maybe you are moving. I know one use case like this where the company is actually moving, right? So they need a new data center, so they're considering Azure as well, and to say, okay, and then more in IaaS way, just to make sure that they could replicate over their on-premise and in the cloud. But mostly in my experience, mostly on the PaaS side. And no, what I see, of course, a lot is containers. That's the it's not the trend anymore. I think it's there for quite a while, but I see more organizations moving to containers rather than pure IaaS. But of course, IaaS, there is always a bit of IaaS in any case, right? Because you typically network virtual appliances, all that kind of services that anyway runs on VMs. But really, companies going only for IaaS, that's not something I see often. Not saying that there is no room for it, but let's say in among my own customers, that's not the primary goal.
Mhm.
Yeah.
How did you see Azure evolve in the last 5 years?
Well, actually, I saw Azure moving from identity to network. No, I mean on the technical. No, I'm saying I'm kidding a bit, but this is true. I mean, 5, 6 years ago, well, everything was public in Azure from a connectivity standpoint, right? And so, except yeah, so if you had VMs and a few PaaS services, you could have them completely isolated from internet, but most PaaS services were public. Now you see that most PaaS services can be privatized. So, and actually Azure itself is now really encouraging this, because if you have Defender for Cloud, any PaaS service that would be public will be flagged by default, right? So will be flagged as okay, that there is room for improvement to try to isolate it. So that's one thing that I see a lot. And then, of course, the rise of data services as well, right? So you see the data platforms. I see more and more data platforms in the cloud. And so now Azure has a quite competitive offering, Databricks, signups, and the likes. And so quite a lot of data services. And no, that's still a trend, but I think that this will be confirmed anyway. It's all AI, of course, right? So I see as well in my own with my own customers that we have a lot more AI related projects than in the past, especially with the rise of Gen AI, right? So that's a trend that
Exactly.
we see as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that the privatization
Yeah.
of the PaaS
Yeah.
services is more and more a trend.
Yeah.
I agree, it's definitely there. But for example, I'm a reviewer for the Azure AI cookbook
Hmm.
that is coming out by Pact Publishing, so the same
Same. Yeah.
one as you.
Yeah.
And I was checking all the recipes and I was doing them on my Azure account, and I had to deploy an Azure OpenAI service,
Hmm.
and it had to accept connections from public,
Yeah. Yeah.
basically.
From
The
everybody.
moment I locked it down,
Yeah.
it wouldn't work anymore. So
Okay.
you
Yeah,
see
yeah, of
that
course.
even
Yeah,
on that side, the security is lagging
yeah.
behind the innovation of AI.
But that's indeed. But I would say that's always a trade-off. So I see that it's mostly now going towards privatization of PaaS services, but indeed it's sometimes an innovation killer. And for instance, if we talk about serverless, right? Because we mostly mentioned PaaS so far, but if you talk about serverless in Azure, it's Azure Functions on the consumption tier. It's basically everything on consumption. If you see this, typically it's not very, let's say, it's not friends with privatization, because most of consumption-based stuff are public. And so, meaning that if you really have policies in your organization that prevent public endpoints, right, for security reasons, then you actually have to get rid of, you cannot then use some of the serverless services, which, in my opinion, is really where the cloud shines the most. I mean, the public cloud, right? Thanks to the scale, it's really an offering where you throw your code and you forget about it, right? And you let the cloud provider allocate what. There are some drawbacks, of course, but you see what I mean? So you don't really need to think deep, let's say, about what resource you will need, about, let's say, about the infrastructure itself. But this is typically on public cloud, of course, multi-tenant underlying infrastructure, so it's not just for you. And so that I see that really more, and I wrote actually a blog post about this 2 years ago. I see a move towards serverless, let's say, features, that self-hosted serverless. That sounds paradoxical, but basically serverless technologies that you host yourself. Give you a concrete example: Azure Functions. You can containerize them and run that in Kubernetes, right? Even on premises. And so you see this, so these kind of nice and very useful serverless, let's say, offering. But instead of running that on consumption tiers where you have no control, people take that in containers so that they can still control the network aspects and so on. So that's something I see more and more. But then, of course, if you host that yourself, it's on you to make it resilient and so on and so on, right? So
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. I like the fact that cloud gives options to move on-prem or the hybrid or even the multi. And in the beginning, it was all Azure
yeah,
only or GCP only,
yeah,
and now you see that they're branching out and
yeah.
opening up.
Indeed, indeed. No, this is good.
But that brings the point to the topic of cloud repatriation,
Yeah,
where organizations say, it's costing me so much money.
yeah,
I'm going to put the workloads back on
Yeah.
premise. Is that something that you're seeing as well, and how do you
No.
see that trend?
On my side, I don't have any customer taking that direction. So maybe it's because I work for them. No, I'm just kidding. No, that's a joke.
You've
That's a
fixed
joke.
it all, they don't have that
Yeah,
worry.
no, that's a joke. No. To be honest, I think that I don't see that. No, I see indeed a growing concern about cost. Because indeed, you really have services that really cost an arm. So if you take in Azure, for instance, the log analytics, that's really something that has a huge cost. And just for logging, right? Logging monitoring. So somehow it's not where the business value is created. So if you tell a business, and I had one customer like this where they were about to pay 75K, per month just for the logs, and then at some point say, okay, but what are we creating with this? What is the return value, right? And so and it's of course hard to explain this, and of course by fine tuning a bit, optimizing what really had to be ingested, then it was reduced to like 20K. Still it's a lot. But
Mhm.
just to say that I see a growing concern about the cost. But I think that's also why you have, let's say, the rise of FinOps right now. It's not a buzzword. I think that a lot of companies who did not pay attention after a few years, then they saw their expenditures exploding. So they said, okay, no, we'll try to tackle this correctly, and also even envision that in the architecture stage as well. Because I also know a lot of our architecture departments where they don't really pay attention about cost. We talk about, I know, quality attributes. What do you want to build? Something resilient, something robust, something performant, and so on. Cost is not the primary concern, but no, that's also a dimension that starts to also be taken into account. And one guy actually called the frugal architect. I don't know if that rings a bell for you, but that's a guy I think working in AWS. But he had the 10 commandments of cost optimization or something like that. But I think it's important because indeed it's really something that will always hit you back, the cost. So I think you'd better tackle that from the start. But if you do it properly, if you make smart choices, to be honest, I think you can still have a very competitive, let's say, hosting platform in the cloud compared to on premises. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, clear. Yeah, you see some companies moving back, especially if they're hosting their own software. Let's say that is towards an end user, so a SaaS company or an ISV,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because they know exactly the whole layers underneath, and they may have the manpower to do it, and then they lease a few data centers across the territory.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
But for most people or most organizations, it's like I don't have the technical knowledge in house, I don't have the right security
yeah,
skills, I don't have the innovation, so we just move public.
yeah, indeed, indeed.
Exactly. But that brings us to the point of cloud security.
Mhm.
So architects usually focus on getting the application to work well, meaning non-functional requirements are like performance and resilience. But are they paying enough attention to cloud security?
Well, I would say it really depends on the organization you work for, right? If you are in the financial sector, I would say yes, because anyway, it's a given. It's part of their DNA to build secure solutions. And so, meaning that somehow the business itself is actually used to it. No, there is no way around. Or sometimes they might be tempted to go elsewhere, an external provider. But in the end, when the external provider has to comply to the same security requirements, then it's not going faster than if they build that themselves. So I would say in such organizations, yes. In others, indeed, security is not the primary concern, of course, because the business, and it makes a lot of sense, but the business is actually trying to bring value, and often the business doesn't see that somehow security is like by design, that they expect it to have it secure by default, right? So it's not like they have to explicitly request a certain level of security, right? It's like by default. It's like when you buy a car, yeah, you might say, okay, yeah, you hope that the wheels will, stay attached to but that's not something that you would explicitly explicitly require or be willing to pay for, right? So, but indeed, so in non-financial sector, I think that indeed it's a battle, and it's also a
Mhm.
trade-off. Again, it's also a question of risk appetite, because ultimately, in my opinion, the business, or you should have an owner, right, of the risk. And so, if at some point it's better to take a risk than not to build the application, or because to address that risk somehow, or those risks, the you have no business case anymore, right? Then it's a trade-off, and I think that but it's indeed a battle, a permanent battle. Again, I'm in plenty of security discussions with my customers. I have to go through compliance processes and so on, explain, educate a bit as well, because that's the hard part. Is that a lot of security architects, let's say, who have more an on-prem background, sometimes you'd still talk a language they don't understand, right? And what I also see is that network is, when we talk about technicalities, typically the perimeter is certainly still there, right? With zero trust and so on, we see beyond perimeter and so on, yes. But you see that in the head of many security architects, the perimeter still is the most important layer. And so that's also a question of education, getting acquainted to what we can do in the cloud and so on. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, and what I'm thinking of actually is the role of a cloud architect usually focuses on getting the application to run
Yeah.
versus the cloud security architect or the security professional. Do you see those two roles growing apart more and more and becoming specialized in their own? Or are you saying they can actually be combined on the same level? How do
Yeah.
you see that
Yeah,
distinction?
it's actually not easy, yeah, because I think it's also a question of skills, right? So you might be let's say a security professional more in the CISSP space, so know which processes should be put in place, and so more on the organization itself, right? Which process is required for ABC, and have no knowledge about technical implementations or technical possibilities and so on. And the other way around, you might be very good in the how we can build something secure, but be completely clueless about what are the processes related to this, right? I don't know, in the identity and access management, for instance, when you have a new joiner, a leaver, and so on, you have all processes attached to this, right? And I think it's a question of first skills, question of interest as well, because you might have people who are very good in the technical details but not interested in the process side of things. So, and typically you have anyway a CISO department, right? In the big, or let's say moderately big organizations, you have a CISO department. So you have security professionals there. I see the cloud architect. For me, a good cloud architect should be able to shed some light on practices that we do in the cloud. What are the capabilities? So should enable, let's say, the CISO department to leverage the right tools and services. Uh, but that's still part of the duties of a cloud architect. Else, you would then say you are a cloud infrastructure architect or a cloud application architect. You see, then you add, let's say, your specialization. But if you just say cloud architect, in my opinion, you should be able to talk about the three layers. So application
Clear.
development, infra, and security, and try to be a good stakeholder for everything that relates to the cloud. That's a bit my view on it.
And staying on the same topic of security and existing roles, we see the rise of
Yeah.
DevSecOps, including the security in the pipelines. In your opinion, what's so special about it? And should developers be trained more on security?
Well, definitely. So developers indeed, and that also makes sense. I was myself a developer in the past, so they don't always have, also the security is not part of their DNA, not especially, right? It depends on the personal interest of developer A and developer B. So, meaning that indeed, you'd better offload this to tools and so on than rely on the discipline of each and every developer. So they should be trained. And again, that will depend as well on the organization they work for, right? Again, financial, non-financial, and so on. I think they should be trained just to understand that it starts with their code, right? I mean, even if you have a lot of tools that can check the code quality, if the code vulnerabilities and so on, still you will never have 100% success, right? So I think that just try to write secure code, rather than write non-secure code is anyway something that every developer should be interested in. Um, but then, yeah, I can see that their focus is really more on building the functionality, right? So which is indeed what they are hired for. In the backlogs, typically sprints of 2 weeks, backlogs, and then features. And the hard part, I would say, with this is that, as I always said, so when you build something new, it's easy to say, okay, this feature we will leave it for the next sprint, for instance, or we can implement it halfway. Or in security or in architecture in general, it's actually harder, because you could say, okay, you aim at reaching a certain maturity level and then you will try to iterate, but let's say, for instance, if I just take something basic, if in security either you have an encryption in transit, either you don't, right? There is no middle ground. And so you see, it's actually quite hard to be let's say, what I see is that a lot of organizations and developers tend to postpone this, right? Because this is not bringing direct value, but it hits them back anyway, right? So indeed, I advocate for more a shift left, and I think it needs to come from both directions. So developers, project team building the project, be more, aware of or sensitive to security topics, and also the CISO departments should also leverage more the shift left, right? And empower as well those teams to actually use the tools, rely on some tools, because sometimes it's also a cultural issue, right? That the CISO departments, okay, everything exists, but the organization is not built to embrace all these, new, well, it's not that new anymore, but let's say more disruptive ways of working. And I
Mm-hmm.
see this, the big change I see, no DevOps, DevSecOps, I think everybody has been exposed to this, right? And I think it has become a common practice with SAST, that, all the scanning and so on, put that in CI/CD. I think it's a given. No, what I see, we actually, with the rise of containers, we actually move more to GitOps. And GitOps, it's yet a disruptive, for me, a new paradigm. It's not just a question of words, right? The mindset is the same, automate everything and so on. But in GitOps, basically, it's typically with Kubernetes or OpenShift, the clusters release themselves automatically, right? So you don't have release pipelines and so on. So these things listen to or are watching some repos, and as soon as you make a pull request to a certain branch, poof, that creates the release. You see, that's yet another way of working, another mindset, and so that is, I still see it for large organizations, something quite new today, right? A lot use Kubernetes in a push mode, so more DevOps way with release that you start yourself and so on. So that's for me the next challenge that I see for big organizations: their adoption of containers and do the let's say practices around it, which are typically GitOps based.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Interesting. There's an interesting perspective there, because what I see in Belgium, at least, is that so many organizations are struggling to find people with the right skills and
yeah,
knowledge. It's already hard to retrain existing people. If you are a networking guy for the last 15 years doing on-premise, then it's a challenge to switch to a cloud mindset,
indeed.
where you lose a bit of control and outsource it to a cloud
Provider.
provider,
Yeah,
let's
yeah,
say.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And the same with DevOps, where you had people doing the DevOps, so now it's a DevSecOps,
Yeah,
so it's adding more on
yeah,
top.
yeah.
How do you see this? And then AI with AI
Yeah.
ops and ML
Yeah,
ops.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
How do you see it moving
Yeah.
forward in
Well,
the future?
actually, it's challenging. Yes, I would say DevSecOps for my customers, I think it's okay. I mean, they are there already somehow, so they have all scanning tools as part of CI/CD, quality gates, that prevent, let's say, for instance, the release or the promotion of one app from an environment to another if it doesn't meet certain requirements. So that, I think you have that again in big organizations. So I'm not talking about the startups. Sometimes I work for startups. Yeah, then it's all in production directly. We have no other environment. You see, so that's another mindset. But let's say for large organizations, I think they are there today. No, indeed, the biggest challenges I see is the ML ops, right? Data ops in general, because in all the Azure data services have their own built-in portals. Data scientists typically, write notebooks. They are more familiar with, let's say, portals and so on. So it's actually quite hard to find the right way of working, right? And automating everything is actually more challenging in that type of, let's say, with that type of workloads than just a web app, for instance, that you would, that you develop and you push over app service or Kubernetes. So that's okay. Data is indeed quite challenging, and of course, no, all the things about Gen AI and so on. Indeed, today I see a lot of POCs, right? But I would not say that I see very mature, practices there yet, not in Belgium at least, and from what I can see. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. And if you compare, because you are, of course, you are the Azure expert, it's all about Azure in your book.
Yeah.
If you compare Azure to other cloud providers and just the evolution, like the strength or weaknesses of others, how do you see that?
But I would compare a bit with AWS, right? Because that's the biggest competitor. Let's say they are even ahead, of course, of Azure. I would say, well, sometimes you have commodities in AWS that you don't have in Azure. So, like for instance, for DNS, you have in AWS you have like certificate managers built in. You have some really infrastructure services that do not exist in Azure where it would really make sense. Um, for the rest, it's quite, the offering is really similar, right? So, I mean, for each AWS service, almost you have an Azure service and vice versa. So it's not like a huge difference. I would say maybe the mindset and the privatizations, right? In AWS, everything was private by default. In Azure, privatization came after, basically, right? So it was first public, and then Microsoft added some mostly private link, right, to privatize your services. So and that you can see as well that from an initial design perspective, it has been thought differently, right? So then it also makes. But I had the opportunity to work on projects where both AWS and Azure were actually used by the customer, and we are creating new foundations. And basically, if you compare the high level, at least architecture was very, very similar. So it's not that you have a world of difference. But of course, as you know, devil is in the details. And I could see, but okay, let's admit as well that I know much better Azure than AWS. But I could see that actually the AWS folks had harder times to do what we could do in Azure. For instance, the network limits in AWS are much lower than in Azure. So, for instance, number of peerings you can have, the number of routes you can have in route tables. You see, so that's the kind of things where I say devil is in the detail. This is the type of detail that can actually make your scaling story quite important, right? So, but yeah, other than this,
Nice.
I think it's quite similar, right?
Yeah, yeah. How about the OpenAI on Azure is now being really promoted, and the co-pilots coming out of that? How do Amazon and Google compare with that?
I don't have a view. I mean, what is clear is that the only thing I could tell is that I don't know really if it was really taking off or not for them, right? So in the GCP and let's say AWS, I can just say that the added value of Azure and OpenAI versus just OpenAI is mostly the fact that you can build enterprise grade solutions like secure it the same way as you would do with other Azure services and basically bring OpenAI within the Azure ecosystem. And that's really the added value of this one. But already with Azure OpenAI projects, for me, I see a lot of initiatives, but it's still, again, more POCs, not really yet fully mature stuff. And it's already hard to follow. So I don't know about, honestly, how it is moving today in AWS or GCP or, yeah.
Yeah,
If you have
okay,
some bits, feel free to share.
yeah. And by the way, cloud is expanding so hard on all
Yeah,
sides.
indeed.
I also give the fundamental trainings, the
Yeah.
AZ900 and all of them. And sometimes I hear a colleague say, "Yeah, but I did it 4 years ago,
Yeah.
the Azure fundamentals." And I said, "Yeah, but
Yeah.
Azure 4 years ago is no
No,
longer the same
indeed.
as Azure today."
Indeed.
So you have.
Yeah.
How do you? What's your secret or your method to keep up and learn
Well,
all the time?
to be honest, well, spend a lot of time. That's the first thing because indeed it doesn't come out of the blue, so you need to spend time. So I try to pick my battles as well now, right? So for instance, now I have become a Kubernetes expert, but I didn't jump on Kubernetes after 3 months. You see what I mean? So I try to wait a bit, or I try to identify if something is just a trend or will stay, right? Because when I was still a developer, I learned countless languages that are dead today, right? So try to not make these mistakes anymore. But of course, you could, and I had this still today, because sometimes you have with open service mesh, right? I'm also a lot in service meshes and so on. And for one customer, back in the days, we had to choose a service mesh that was supported. So we went for OSM, Open Service Mesh from Microsoft, and now they archived it. Right, so it's still supported, but it's of course not future-proof anymore. So I try to pick my battles, and then, well, being always listening, I work on different for different customers, right? So it also allows me then to see different ways of working, different challenges, so it's very enriching, sometimes tiring as well, but very enriching. And then and always try to be humble, listen to what others have to say, right? Because there's more in two brains than in one. And that's it, and try to follow. But indeed, as you said, is it's moving, it's a continuous learning, really.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
yeah,
And even as an architect, I mean, you have to choose, will I
indeed.
kind of specialize in one cloud
Yeah,
provider and Azure, or will I go
yeah,
multi-cloud?
yeah.
You have to make decisions
Yeah,
there.
for
Any
me,
advice for those
yeah,
people?
but it depends. So for me, definitely I'm uh, in Azure, right? Because then I can be very vertical. It's already very broad, so it's already very challenging to be vertical just in one cloud. So T-shaped, but with really verticality, and also Kubernetes, right? Because that is definitely a good bet, because that you find it everywhere, including on premises. Of course, there are difference between an on-prem cluster and, let's say, a cloud-based cluster, but at least I think that's something that definitely everyone should go to, right? Kubernetes, because it's everywhere, and it's a world in itself, right? If you look at the CNCF landscape, that's always what I show when I give trainings on Kubernetes. I show the students the CNCF landscape, and you see that it's a huge set of solutions, and some of these solutions are as big as Kubernetes itself, right? So then you realize, okay, that's really a huge universe, right? So for me, I think we look more for experts than for generalists. So, and I think I
Yes,
doubt you can really be expert in three clouds. Or then you
I
have
tend to agree
an
there.
incredible brain, because with one it's already hard, and especially if you take Kubernetes on top, which is everywhere, you have already a lot to stay busy, let's say.
Yes. Moving to your book,
Yeah,
the Azure Cloud Native Architecture Map book, what I really loved about is the visuals. You have some nice visuals, like some how do you call it, mind maps, where
yeah,
you start with a concept and then you show all the legs
yeah.
of that concept. How did the book do? How's it doing in sales? Is it picked up? How did it go over the last few years?
Well, actually, it went quite well. I think it's quite a good a success story, I would say. So, Microsoft actually bought some copies, right? Because you can have the book for free on Azure.microsoft.com. I mean, the PDF version. And so, no, I think but it went quite well, and I'm surprised that it's still actually being bought today, right? Of course, not to the same extent as before. And to be honest, I think that 80 to 85% of what is in the book is still valid today. So it's not,
Mhm.
of course, there are some new services that cannot be in the book because they are new. There are changes, of course, but I think yeah, a good 80% is certainly still very valid. So, which is then not bad. And again, it's kind of unique in how the content is brought to the reader. That was really the entry point. The goal was really to make this unique, to say, okay, you have the helicopter view, and then I zoom on some use cases, and all these use cases are inspired from real world projects, right? That I really had. And so, okay, let's maybe like the global API platform. There's one of the use cases there. Well, I don't remember all the things that I put, but it's all inspired from real world initiatives. So to try to not only
Great.
be a helicopter, but sometimes dive a little more. Let's say
Great,
was a bit
great.
the goal.
Which brings me to the question of the future
Yeah.
for this book, Stefan. Are you looking for a second edition or something else?
We discussed it with Pact, and then at some point they said, okay, would like to have the second edition, but without maps. Said, okay, but then it's not the map book anymore, right? So, and they were just looking for another book for on solution architecture on Azure. And so in the end, okay, we had some exchange, but it didn't lead anywhere. So I said, okay, either it's another map book, and then I could consider it, right? Because for me, that's what makes it unique. It's the visuals as well.
Exactly. Exactly.
Uh, Either okay, then just so basically, I think there will be no second first because we discussed that like a year and a half ago, something like that, even though almost maybe 2 years ago, and plus it's quite um, it takes time, right? So then also I have to consider this as well. So
Okay.
yeah.
Any LinkedIn courses? I see you as a LinkedIn trainer or something like that. So that you have that gift of teaching
Uh,
and communicating
No,
well.
but I don't give trainings on LinkedIn. So I basically give some trainings, let's say, to I don't know if I can advertise, but it's
Sure,
something
go ahead.
called your Azure Coach. So basically, I give trainings through that organization. I don't give too many trainings. I like to also stay. I wouldn't like to spend all my time, let's say, giving trainings. So I really want to spend time at customer side, but then of course and enrich my trainings with this, right? So that's I think what makes the difference somehow. um but that's it, yeah.
Very
No,
nice.
yeah.
Great. I'm also going to put the link below that people can watch it or view it. It's great.
Perfect.
And then Stefan, to wrap up,
Yeah.
what is in the future of Azure you think looking forward the next few years?
Oof, hard to say, yeah. So
Let
uh,
me prime you with some things. We've seen the rise of Fabric.
yeah,
We've seen the rise of Copilots. We've seen Azure OpenAI.
yeah,
There are a few other things that I'm forgetting now, but confidential computing
yeah,
is getting
indeed,
more and more.
yeah,
So these are like seeds being
yeah,
planted and some grow.
yeah.
How do you see it forward?
Well, I think confidential computing could be one thing because, again, I think what I see now is that many organizations try to have a cloud environment that is more secure than what they have on-prem. So that could be, one way to make it even more secure. And also, I know that Mark Rusinovich is pushing hard on confidential compute. So Microsoft, let's say, is really behind. So if the vendor itself pushes hard, then of course that can also generate more activity around it. AI, that's for sure. I mean, that cannot be otherwise because somehow the the the, the, the incredible improvement of Gen AI is just something that of course every company will leverage sooner or later. So I think there will be no way back. I think we also reach a new paradigm. It's a paradigm shift as well here, and really, so because I have an NLP background, I didn't see it coming. I mean, the Gen AI stuff so fast, so good. That was really something surprising. So I'm pretty sure that this will be leveraged by all organizations, right? So that it's there to stay. And again, data platform, yeah, I see that already, an increase of data platform. So I suppose that this will um, move on following the same path. So I think all the seeds that you mentioned are indeed already, some are already well planted. The what indeed, where maybe it might be just a promise, is the computational compute. So time will tell if indeed there is an adoption of this. But I think it could, and one of the reasons why I think it could be the case is that you see a growing demand on Kubernetes, right? Shared clusters, shared environments. So that could be if you have a lot of applications running the same cluster, sometimes the same node, and so on. So that might be also a good reason to, at some point, indeed bring confidential compute to just make sure that encryption in memory, encryption in use, as it's called, is indeed ensured. Yeah. But let's see.
Let's see. What I like about Azure is that Microsoft is step by step converting the regular PaaS services into a confidential
Yeah,
flavor.
indeed.
Like you
Yeah,
get regular SQL, now you got confidential
indeed.
SQL, confidential containers already there. So you're seeing how they're stacking it
Yeah.
up, and yeah, the next evolution.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, that's indeed definitely indeed. I mean, that's indeed a layer that has been neglected so far, right? Encryption in use. We've always been talking about encryption in transit, encryption at rest, and that's indeed a layer that was not really considered so far. But I think that now that we have more and more shared environments, it's definitely it makes sense to have this as well.
Yeah, I think one other seed that Microsoft planted a few years ago, which is now really taking off, is the multi-cloud, the
Yeah,
multi-cloud
indeed.
approach. I
Yeah,
mean, Defender for cloud, you
yeah,
can run them on
yeah.
GCP and AWS and on-premise. So, is that something you also see evolve, like the more open mind of
Yeah,
Microsoft?
that's for sure. But for me, to be honest, that open mind, I saw it since the arrival of Satya Nadella. So that's definitely, I think he started that wave, let's say, because before him, Microsoft was rather like Microsoft only. You see, so we are the best, we always do the best products, and so on. No, I think they basically see, okay, what's on the market, try to see to indeed not pretend that they are alone, right? So Azure is not the only cloud, and indeed it's much smarter to say, look, you have Azure Arc, you have something you can basically use that elsewhere on premise in another cloud, and indeed realize that indeed that's competition is there, but find ways to integrate, right? And basically expand Azure beyond Azure. But they do that with everything now. I mean, look at the VS Code and that kind of stuff. You know, that's the funny part. If you see VS Code, it's a very real success story. I mean, I think the top users are Linux people. So I saw a stat at some point. I forgot the numbers, but typically the ones who hated Microsoft, maybe still for some. But you see, so that's kind of ironic to see that no, Microsoft really embraced open source a lot. So I think the Microsoft of today has nothing to see. I mean, in terms of mindset, with the Microsoft of 10 years ago, Balmer times and Balmer days, let's say.
Exactly.
So Nadella really made a change.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Yeah, definitely. And I see Azure opening up also with the Azure Arc
yeah,
extending to on premise. You can run some services like the machine learning services on premise or in your basement, but with the control plane in Azure.
yeah.
All these things are relatively new in the last 2 years.
Indeed,
So
indeed,
that's a great move.
indeed. No, that's indeed
Correct.
definitely good.
With that said, Stefan, I want to thank you for joining this episode.
Thank you too.
It was great to have you on.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
I hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you. So hopefully, yeah. So have a nice day and see you soon then. Thank you.
Thank
See
you.
you. Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Blue Dragon Podcast, a podcast dedicated to IT decision makers and helping them gain perspective of what's going on in cloud, AI, and security. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a thumbs up, like, and subscribe to the channel so you'll be up to date all the time when new episodes come out. Your support really means a lot to me. Thank you very much. Have a great day and see you next time.